welcome back. Thanks for joining us for week 2 of The Hope of Christmas, our unit this month in the Smith and Hellways Formation Series. And Christy, last week we introduced the class to God's deliverance. And that was one of the things that the writers wanted us to take a look at in terms of the things that can bring about the hope of Christmas. Today we're going to be talking about renewal and restoration. And we're actually going to be looking at another of the major prophets. We'll be taking a look at Jeremiah, whose ministry actually went through the Babylonian exile. And generally, Jeremiah's prophecies were tended to be a little bit things that people didn't want to hear. And today it's kind of interesting that we get almost a positive message from him. But we're in Jeremiah 33, verses 10 through 16. And, in verse 10, Jeremiah is describing what life in Jerusalem looks like after the third wave. Over a 20-year period, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians had repeatedly hammered this town. And after the third wave, there was nobody left. There was no animals, it says. There were no humans. It was quiet. It was a ghost town. And so that's where he begins this conversation about renewal and restoration. But it sets up a great contrast, Christy, correct?
Yeah, it does, Joe. And in verses 11 through 13, we start to see Jeremiah, his first references to what restoration will look like. And he talks about really some of the sounds or the voices of renewal, such as the voice of mirth and gladness, and hearing a bridegroom and the bride, and people will be singing. And so you get this picture of a street that was very desolate, and then all of a sudden it comes alive and it's vibrant, and it has just so much powerful messages for people, and it's just a prosperous time. It's a time where people, you would not think that they had experienced desolation. And he even talks about the fact that there will be pastures for the shepherds, resting their flocks. And he goes on to describe the region, not just Jerusalem that's going to be restored, Joe, but the entire region, and how things are going to be better tomorrow than they are right now. It's just unfortunate. At this point, the people that he's talking to don't have a good point of reference here to follow along with Jeremiah. But you can tell that Jeremiah has some confidence. And what do you think about, why is he so confident in this? And he says it with such rigor and just gusto. So very different from what his messages have been in the past.
Yeah, no doubt. Jeremiah believes, he says there in verse 14, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I'll fulfill the promises I made to the house of Israel, the house of Judah. In those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. And Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety, and my righteousness will be restored. And so, yes, Jeremiah is clinging to the promises of God, and it's kind of like what we have to do, Christy. I think that we can very much relate to this story. What's interesting to me about Jeremiah, though, is he probably didn't really know what the righteous branch was. And when I think about us today, we can relate to this story because, there are parts of our life that look like a ghost town, devoid of joy, devoid of happiness, in bad need of repair, right? And yet we know that this branch of righteousness that was lifted, we know how this story ended up because we know about Jesus. Who knows what Jeremiah thought this was going to look like, if it was a messianic vision, if it was more about a king that was going to be a military leader. But we know how this ends up. And so it's certainly, we can relate to this, and it's a reminder to us that if we want to bring renewal and restoration into our lives, we need to hang on the promises of God.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And I think that, for me, we have to put this story in perspective to know that this is not the first time that God's people have been in a very challenging situation, or they maybe have felt isolated or like God has left them. And to be real honest and frank, we probably all have had those times in our lives where we have felt isolated and desolate from something, whether it be a relationship or a job or a career, or even on our own spiritual journey. And it won't be the last time. I mean, if you haven't experienced it yet in your life, it's just a matter of probably when. And I think what Jeremiah is trying to do here is he wants the people to believe that, hey, things are going to be better tomorrow because God's in control and he's made a promise to us. And I think in one of our commentaries that we read, one of the writers, Lewis Smedes, said, he talks about God's grace, and grace is the power to live now as if things are going to be all right tomorrow. And that's a big comfort for any of us, that things are going to be all right tomorrow. It doesn't mean that maybe it's not going to happen instantly. Maybe it will take some time. But things, if we believe in God's promise and in the hope that he has given us, then that should bring us comfort to get to the next stage. What about you, Joe?
I think about, an idea that we talk about every so often in Sunday school. Christians are not immune to the problems out there. We live in the same chaotic world as everybody else, and we have the same problems everybody else has. I think it's unrealistic to put that pressure on yourself that if you're a Christian, somehow your life's going to be perfect, because it won't, right? What I think is different, and I think what Jeremiah is talking about here is, we should be able, is how we handle when things are not going well. That's what being a Christian, that's where the difference is. Because when we can lean on the promises of God, we can live our life. I agree with you. I love what he says there. It's the power to live now as if things are going to be all right. And, we know that God is going to take care of us. And so, I think this positive message of hope based on the promises of God is a big part about what waiting for Christmas is. And it's about the hope of Christmas. And I think for me, it would be this week to take a look at and identify those desolate, messy, sad places in our lives, and to lay them at the altar, and to ask God to come into our life, and I think that based on that confidence we have in the message of salvation in His Son Jesus, we too can be like a Jeremiah, living in a ghost town, buying property because one day we know it's all going to be waterfront, right? And actually, I read somewhere that Jeremiah actually bought property knowing that things were going to get restored, and I think that's great. I think that's great.
I agree, and I think for me, along with just that question of what in my life needs renewing and restoring, I think the other piece for me is once I figure out what those things are, what is my true hope for this Christmas? How is it going to be different from other Christmases? And, I have to focus a whole lot on those promises that God has made. And I also have to remember from last week, the whole concept of listen and look and lift. And it's really something I've really enjoyed, Joe, this unit so far, because I think it's just really practical information for modern day Christians for us to remember, especially during this time of Christmas and busyness.
Well, if we didn't already have enough else on our plates. They're calling for winter weather this weekend, so for all we know, Christie, this may be our Sunday school class chance to get a lesson this week. We may or may not be at church, but I hope people will come and to read the scripture text and to think about renewal and restoration and the positive message based on the promises of God. Next week we're going to be back in Isaiah chapter 40, and we're going to be talking about how God comforts us. We'll be talking about feeding His flock. So anyway, I hope everybody will come back next week and join us when we do our third lesson. Until then, hope everybody has a great week. God bless you, and we'll see you again next time.